Hello and welcome back. We are on to our first organ of the endocrine system, which is the pituitary gland, which is a biggie. It is the most productive. I don't know if it's the most productive like quantity wise, but it produces the most different kinds of hormones. How's that? Most other endocrine organs produce maybe one or two hormones. The pituitary gland produces and or secretes 9 different hormones, so it's quite busy. So that's why we're going to tackle this one first. All right, so let's take a look at the anatomy of the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. So to get your bearings, you might remember, so we'll kind of take a look at our brain landmark diagram here. So if you remember, the pituitary gland sits just posterior to the optic chiasm, a little bit anterior to the mammillary body, and it's sitting in the hypophyseal fossa, or the cell of the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Remember that bone marking way back from 231? So it's very nicely protected within that bony case of the sella turcica. And it has 3 major regions. We have the anterior pituitary gland, 2 major regions, and the posterior pituitary gland. I guess 3, I don't know. The infundibulum is the stalk. Okay. We're going to focus mainly on the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And I'm really not so concerned about the 3 different pars, the tuberalis, the distalis, and the intermedia. Not really concerned about that. Just make sure you know the difference between the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And we'll be seeing this in lab in our microscope slide. So that's kind of structurally where it's found. And now let's take a closer look at the blood supply, which is going to be really important. Okay. And the relationship with the hypothalamus. Okay, so in a typical vascular network, you have arteries that deliver oxygen-rich blood to a tissue. Then they branch into capillaries, right? So I'm not going to be able to draw the tubes very well. And then the capillaries is where you get all of your exchange, and then it drains via a vein, right? So this is the vein. These are the capillaries, and these are the arteries. Okay, so this is a typical capillary blood flow. So arteries, capillary bed, veins. And it is a capillary bed where you get exchange. So oxygen gets dropped off, CO2 gets picked up. If you have hormones or nutrients, those also can get dropped off. Waste products can get picked up. Other hormones can get picked up. So the capillary bed is the region of exchange. Now we have 2 different sets of capillary beds in your pituitary gland. So the first one that we have is the one that feeds the posterior lobe, and it looks like a typical capillary bed. We have arterial blood coming in, we have the capillary bed, and we have venule blood coming out. Okay, that's like a typical capillary bed. The anterior lobe capillary bed, though, is different because if you take a look at that collection of blood vessels right here that I'm circling, okay, we have our arterial flow in. Okay, we have our capillary bed. I'm going to put into purple. I know it's kind of hard to see with all those other things. So that's our capillary bed, and it's drained by veins, right? Great, everything's good, but take a look at what happens again. Instead of draining into a vein that goes all the way back to the heart, it drains into another capillary bed, which I'm encircling in purple. Then it drains again to head to your circulatory system veins. So this is what's unique. It is a capillary bed draining into another capillary bed before it drains back into general circulation. And this is what we call the hypophyseal portal system. There's one other portal system we're going to take a look at in 233. It's called the hepatic portal system, which is a couple sets of capillary beds in the liver. So in the digestive system in the liver. So I'm going to erase all my drawings here so it's clear. But the idea is we have 2 capillary systems because if you remember, one of the functions of the hypothalamus to regulate the anterior lobe was to secrete hormones, to stimulate it hormonally. So if you have hormones, let me grab a dark blue. So if you have a hormone being secreted in the hypothalamus, and your destination is the pituitary gland, You don't want to have to send that hormone into general circulation, back to the heart, out to the lungs, back to the heart, out to the body to get back to the pituitary, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. You want a shortcut. And so that's exactly what the portal system does. It allows for these hormones to go directly to their target without having to go all the way through the rest of general circulation. So then that's going to trigger the anterior lobe pituitary, and then they will secrete their hormones, which can go into the general circulation, which is going to go to their target, which could be your liver or your adrenal gland or your thyroid gland. So it allows for a more efficient communication between those hypothalamic regulatory hormones and the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Just the anterior lobe. The posterior lobe's got its own control. It's neural control, because we have the supraoptic nucleus, which releases ADH, and we have the paraventricular, which releases oxytocin. Okay, so they produce those hormones in the neurons that are located in those two nuclei within the hypothalamus. They exoplasmic transport them all the way down, and then when you need oxytocin or ADH, they send their little action potential, choo, 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 and they release those hormones directly into that capillary bed, like a synaptic release, like an exocytosis at a regular synapse, but it's going into the bloodstream, not onto another neuron. So ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus, released from the posterior lobe into that typical looking capillary bed. Okay, so make sure you're comfortable with that. If you have questions or need clarification, ask me during lab time or office hour, or send me an email. Okay, so that's super important, the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, so let's go through the hormones of the pituitary gland. I'm thinking of, usually it is at this point in lecture that I describe a good approach to studying and learning your hormones. And I am not a huge fan of flashcards. They are good for some things, but they are not great for all things. So they're not good if you end up with a huge stack of, 200 flashcards for a chapter. That's too overwhelming. But I think flashcards are a good way to study your hormones. So I don't have a lot of blank space like I would on a board. So I'm just going to write it over this. So let's say this is the front of your flashcard. Okay, you have to know the abbreviation, the name, the target, the function, and the let's see. Let me back up. Let's start with the back first. So you need to know the name. You need to know the origin, right? So like, where does it come from? You need to know its target, and you need to know its effect. Okay, so for example, we'll take one of these. We'll take TSH. Okay, so on the front of your card, you would write TSH. On the back of your card, you would write thyroid stimulating hormone, but you would write it all out because you're not having to write on a screen. The origin would be the anterior pituitary. Okay, your target would be the thyroid gland. And the effect would be stimulates the release of T3 and T4, or thyroid hormones, however you want to word it. I just had to cram everything on this little drawing. So that is what your flashcards might look like. Have the abbreviation on the front, the name, the origin, the target, and the effect on the back side. So if you wanted to start making your flashcards, gosh, my brain just lost it there. Your hormone flashcards now, and I probably have already encouraged you to do this in lab time before we started this, because there's a lot of information and you want to give yourself enough time to learn, memorize your hormones, and also be able to answer questions about their control and their effects on all of these body tissues. So just be aware that you are going to need to know the information about every hormone that we cover. And I think in the lecture notes, I've made a table and a list of kind of the things that you can put on your flashcards to help you with that. So if you have any questions over the lecture notes or which hormones you need to know, it's pretty much all of them, with a few exceptions there towards the end of the others. Just please ask. Okay, so in the notes, I have all of this stuff. You can just go through the book and fill it out. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. I usually have to rush through in-person lecture, because I always run out of time. I don't have that constraint here, but I also don't want to be making hours-long videos to cover all the stuff that you can just get out of the textbook. So I'm just going to briefly go through this and mention some key features that are important to kind of take away. So I'm just going to go through the list here. So we have, the first one is our thyroid stimulating hormone. So that's our TSH. Maybe I'll just kind of encircle them as I go through them. So thyroid stimulating hormone, and again, all of these are coming from the anterior lobe, so you don't have to say origin every time, targets the thyroid gland, triggers the release of T3, T4. Okay, so this is a tropic hormone because, or the thyroid gland is hormonally stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, which is kind of nice because the name gives you a clue. So this is a tropic relationship, a hormone triggering the release of another hormone. Okay. So the next one is ACTH. Okay. ACTH. We have two parts of the adrenal gland. The ACTH is functioning mainly with the cortex, so that's what we're going to talk about here. It stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adreno, because it targets the adrenal gland. Cortico, because it targets the release of corticosteroids. Tropic, because it's a hormone triggering the release of another hormone. So again, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, gives you clues as to where it goes and what it does, which are the main things that you're going to be putting on your flashcard anyways. Okay. All right, the next one is follicle stimulating hormone. Since it is what's called a gonadotropin, it stimulates the release of hormones from the gonads, it does stimulate both male and female. So follicle stimulating hormone, in females, it triggers the release of or follicle development, follicle stimulating hormone. And with that, the secrete of estrogen, right? So as you develop the follicle, estrogen follows along. And in males, FSH triggers the production and the stimulation of sperm. Okay. All right. Luteinizing hormone is the other gonadotropin, so we're going to cross paths over here. So luteinizing hormone in females targets the ovaries and triggers ovulation, as well as, let's see, ovulation and the production of the corpus luteum, which leads to progesterone secretion. And in males, it stimulates the production of testosterone. All right, so that is our FSH and LH. The next one is prolactin. Prolactin is for lactating females, targets the mammary glands and stimulates the production of breast milk. And then, oh, I'm running out of room, so I'm going to erase all of those so we don't get all too confused. So then we have growth hormone, GH. Growth hormone is an interesting one because the growth hormone itself does not go directly to the bone and muscle, which are the primary targets. It does target all tissues, but those are the main ones. It actually goes to the liver, and then the liver gets signals to make an intermediate or a secondary hormone called somatomedins. But you can just label it as growth hormone. I don't really care about the somatomedins part. So if you just say growth hormone targets bone and skeletal muscle, that's totally fine. Triggers the production of, or stimulates cell growth and the production of protein synthesis inside those cells, which is what cells are made of, primarily proteins. So if you're increasing protein synthesis, you are increasing cell growth. And the last one comes from that middle part of the anterior lobe. It's MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. So remember, melanocytes are those pigment producing cells in your skin, and it increases the production of melanin. However, it is not a significant function in healthy adults. So you see MSH being secreted locally, normally. So MSH in your skin is normal, but MSH from your anterior pituitary lobe isn't normal in most healthy adult individuals. All right, so those are the hormones of the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So let's take a look at the posterior lobe, which I have shaded. So let's shade everything else. So keep our minds focused. All right, so just like I had mentioned before, we have the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei. It is the cell bodies of those neurons in the hypothalamus that generate the ADH and oxytocin. They travel through that axonic transports down and kind of get stored in the synaptic vesicles. And then when an action potential shows up, it would release ADH and oxytocin directly into the bloodstream. So this would be a great examples of neural stimuli. Let me back up. All of those other hormones that we just talked about in the anterior lobe, they're all hormonally regulated by hormones from the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus send out little regulatory hormones through the portal system, communicate to their target cells in the anterior lobe, which triggers them to release their hormone. Those are called releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones. So you're like, oh, I'm going to trigger the release of growth hormone. That hormone from the hypothalamus is called GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. Or I want to slow down the release of growth hormone. The hypothalamus will release a hormone called growth hormone inhibitory hormone. So the names aren't super fancy. They're pretty straightforward. So thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone inhibitory hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibitory hormone. So that is the hormonal regulation of the anterior lobe. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. But now that we're on the pituitary or the posterior lobe, it is neural. So both of these are under neural control. As these neurons in the hypothalamus send their action potential, release ADH to target the kidneys, release oxytocin for women to the uterus and breast, as well as prostate glands for males. So what do these hormones do? Well, ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. So it reduces urine production, okay? Which is going to decrease blood pressure and increase blood pressure, increase blood volume because you're not peeing out as much water. For oxytocin in females, it triggers uterine contractions, usually during labor, and it will stimulate mammary glands for milk letdown reflex during breastfeeding. And for males, it targets the prostate gland for secretory actions, as well as the ductus deferens, smooth muscle for peristalsis of moving along sperm in the male reproductive tract. All right, so those are our posterior hormones. Okay. All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about is kind of diving back into that regulatory control of hypothalamic control of the adenohypophysis, which was our anterior lobe. So just like I was trying to talk about on that last slide, is we have the releasing hormones, the regulatory hormones coming from the hypothalamus travel down that portal system to communicate to the target cells in the anterior lobe, which are the ones that make their own hormone, to release that into the bloodstream. A little bit more complex behind the scenes that's going on is a lot of this control has some feedback mechanisms to it, kind of this negative feedback mechanism. So over here on the left, we have a general pattern here. So let's say, and they're using red arrows for stimulation and the blue lines for inhibition. So let's say we have hormone 1 coming from the anterior lobe. It is going to be stimulated by the releasing hormone that is made in the hypothalamus, right? So that's the green square is making the releasing hormone. It travels to the portal system, finds its target tissue, which releases hormone 1. Hormone 1 goes to its target out in the body, releasing hormone 2 to then go and do its thing, right? So that's this one kind of complex reflex, is we have a hormone telling a gland to release a hormone, telling a gland to release a hormone. In this particular case, though, that second hormone, the one that comes from the targeted endocrine tissue, can function as a negative feedback to the anterior lobe itself, as well as the hypothalamus. So once this second level organ, this endocrine organ that's releasing hormone 2 is getting stimulated, it's releasing its hormone, that excess amount of hormone is going to come back and slow down the hypothalamus to slow down the anterior lobe, which is going to slow down the endocrine organ, which is going to slow down its production of hormone 2, which is then going to slow down the inhibition of it. And then it will start the whole cycle again. So it helps to maintain, so we don't overload our systems full of this hormone. It allows for that feedback response to happen. So that's just the general pattern. Well, let's take a look at some specific examples. So we have our thyroid stimulating hormone example here. Okay. So the green in these real examples was the regulatory hormone or the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. In this case, it's called thyrotropic releasing hormone, or TSH-RH. Either one of those is fine. The thyrotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus triggers the pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That's the blue one at this level. That thyroid stimulating hormone is going to target the thyroid gland to release its hormone, which is the T3, T4. It is those hormones here that will come back and inhibit the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus in that whole scenario that we saw over here. Whoops, can I erase all my lines so we can see that a little bit more clear. All right, we can do the same thing with another example. I don't know exactly what CRH stands for. I'm going to say corticotropic releasing hormone. So CRH would be a regulatory hormone from the hypothalamus, targeting the pituitary gland anterior lobe to release ACTH, which targets the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. And it is the glucocorticoids that would come back and inhibit the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, so we don't overload the system with ACTH and glucocorticoids. Okay, so these are just a few examples. I don't need to work through all of them. You can work through a couple of them yourself. But the big picture is, again, know that this hypothalamic control is tightly regulated. Hypothalamus tells the anterior lobe what to do. Anterior lobe sends out a hormone to tell another organ what to do. It releases its hormone, which could then come back and give some feedback to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland itself. Okay, and it can get a little bit complex, as seen here in the somatomedins example, some stimulatory and some inhibitory, based on whether we're having inhibitory releasing hormones or inhibitory regulatory hormones or releasing regulatory hormones. Okay, that's a mouthful. All right, so again, send questions, ask questions during lab, or come to an office hour. I'd be happy to help. All right, I will see you next time for our next round of endocrine organs. Bye.